Welcome to the Hellenic Writers Group of Washington, D.C. My name is Dr. Ipatia Pastelidis, and I am filling in for the director, Andy Petridis. Today we are pleased to host author Shelley Dark, who will talk about her books, share wisdom, and tips about research plus more. Shelley will be introduced by our very own Maria Karamitsos, journalist, author, poet, and marketing pro. There will be a question and answer session after the talk. Without further ado, Maria, the mic is yours.
All right, thank you. Hello, Hellenic Writers Group of Washington, D.C. I'm Maria Karamitsos, and it's an honor for me to introduce today's speaker. Shelley Dark is a best-selling and award-winning Australian author of historical fiction and narrative nonfiction. After a lifetime raising cattle on Queensland's Granite Belt, she reinvented herself as a writer, relocating with her husband to the Sunshine Coast and embarking on a research journey that took her to archives in Greece, Malta, Britain, Ireland, and Australia. In her lighthearted memoir, Hydra in Winter, she traces her solo journey during the winter to the island of Hydra in search of her husband's ancestor, Ghikas Voulgaris, Australia's first Greek convict who narrowly escaped execution. It was a notable book of 2025 by one of Australia's most respected literary critics, Samuel Bernard, in the Weekend Australian, and was awarded a gold medal in the biographical travel and explorer category in the Global Book Awards 2025. Her latest book, a historical novel called Son of Hydra, is a sweeping tale inspired by Ghikas' life, spanning the Greek War of Independence to early colonial New South Wales. It has won wide critical acclaim and a silver medal in the historical fiction category in the Global Book Awards 2025. Shelley's work explores exile, identity, belonging, and reinvention, and is known for its rigorous research, emotional restraint, and vivid sense of place. She's currently working on two other book projects. One is the story of Mary Lyons, Ghikas' wife, and the other is about reinvention. Her recent talks in Australia about reinvention have garnered much praise. Stay tuned over the next few months as she talks more about reinventing yourself, even in your 70s. She is a member of two writers groups, the All Right Club and Noosa's Writers on the Coast. I first encountered Shelley in early 2025 after the release of Hydra in Winter. I read and reviewed the book, and then she reached out. We got on a Zoom call to discuss promoting her book in the Greek community. I loved her wit, her personality, her boundless energy. Honestly, it feels like I've known her for years. I've so enjoyed working with her, and she's such an inspiration. When she's not writing, she's usually researching or traveling, and she's always hot on the trail of the perfect cream bun. Speaking of research, that's why we're here today. To put the pieces together, the pieces of the puzzle, Shelley chased down a pirate on several research trips over a period of 7 years. The research took her to different parts of Australia and across Europe, from tracking down genealogical records to prove her husband was Ghikas' descendant, until recently he had no idea, to tracing Ghikas' and Mary's steps. The stories about her research are equally as fascinating as her books. Maybe that's a future book too. This afternoon, Shelley will speak to us about the challenges she encountered, including the fact that Ghikas' name was spelled 33 different ways in Australian records alone. And she'll provide some tips for your own research. Friends, you're in for a big treat today. It's the middle of the night in Australia, and we're so grateful to Shelley for taking the time to join us today. She's lots of fun, and you're going to love her too. So, without further ado, please welcome award-winning, best-selling author, Shelley Dark.
Thank you so much, Maria, for that lovely introduction. And thank you to the Washington Writers Group for inviting me. It's such an honor, and aren't we just so lucky? I mean, if it weren't for COVID, we probably wouldn't all be meeting the way we are. You know, the fact that I can talk to you in Washington and we can connect as writers is just such a beautiful thing, isn't it? I'm really just so happy to be here. And as Maria said, the story of Ghikas Voulgaris has really turned my life upside down. It sort of turned a retirement on its head, in fact, because my husband didn't know anything about his ancestor at all, his Greek ancestor. In Australia in the 50s, in the 1950s, when he was a boy, it really wasn't a very welcome thing to find out that you had a convict in your history. People didn't want convicts, they wanted to be free settlers. And so nothing was ever said to him. His mother would have known because it came through his maternal line, and she would have known, but there was no mention of it whatsoever. And it was the convict part that would have been the shameful part. And so when our son he would have been in his 20s, and he had been down near the Snowy Mountains in Australia, which is a long way south of here, a thousand miles or so. And he'd been down there filming for a TV show that he worked for. And he came home, and we lived on a farm. We were cattle farmers, or ranchers, as you call it. And he came home one day and sat down at the dinner table, and he said to John, my husband, "By the way, Dad, are we Greek?" And John looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. And he said, "No, why?" And Ben said, "Well, someone told me we're descended from Australia's first Greek convict." And John's jaw dropped. And then Ben added, "And he was a pirate." Whoa. My first thought was not Palakeri. My first thought was Johnny Depp. And my second thought was, where's all the loot? And I'm sorry to report there was no loot, which frankly was devastating. It took me years to recover. So they dismissed it almost as a joke. John said, "I think someone's having a joke with you." And they just dismissed it. And we were busy, working on the farm. The internet at that stage was terribly slow, that you could try to load a banking page and drive to town and do the banking, and by the time you came home, the page might have loaded. So it wasn't very easy to do any research at that stage. I did manage to find on the internet the Monaro Pioneers website, and that told me, in fact, that it was true. It was a nice, clean, heroic story. His name was Ghikas Voulgaris, and several generations of descendants proved that my husband John was his great-great-grandson. And the story was on this website, the story was that during the Greek Revolution against the Ottoman Turks in 1827, 9 Greek boys from the island of Hydra are on a ship called the Heracles. They rob a Maltese ship. They get convicted of piracy by the British. They're sentenced to death. And then they appeal their sentence, and in the end, they're transported to New South Wales. Ghikas was then sent to a town called Braidwood, or it wasn't a town then, it was to a sheep property. So as a shepherd, he married a maid, a housemaid, and they settled near Nimity Bell, which is down south of Australia. And they had 10 children. He became a landholder and a naturalised Australian. So it was a classic Greek boy makes good story, but that was all I could find out at that stage. And I was a bit thrilled about the whole idea until the obvious question hit me. I thought, hang on, am I married to the great-great-grandson of a bad guy? Is there pirate blood in my children's veins? But then I remember neither of our children have shown the slightest interest in robbing merchant vessels, so that was a relief. But I wanted to know more, and as I said, we were still on the farm, so the pirate had to wait until we retired. We've been retired now for 18 years, which I find difficult to believe. I feel as if it was only yesterday. But so we've retired to the beach. And when we retired to the beach, we got proper broadband, dangerous levels of broadband. And the pirate story came roaring back like a drunk uncle at a Greek wedding. So the house began filling up with scraps of Ghikas notes beside the computer, printouts on the dining room table, books arriving in the mail, half-finished sentences beginning, John, can you believe? And I really did go full on obsession. I fell down more Greek history rabbit holes than is advisable for a woman of my age. And I'd often sit down at breakfast to check one fact, and I'd emerge at the end of the day with a stiff back and shocked it was dark outside. Meanwhile, the pirate's descendant had been surfing, playing bowls and croquet, and was on his second beer. So I read online that the authority on these boys was Hugh Gilchrist. He'd been a former Australian ambassador to Greek, and he'd written 2 volumes called Australians and Greeks. And I read online that there was 2 full chapters about the boys. The book was out of print at the time, but I hunted down a second-hand copy, and that was a really exciting day when that arrived. So the story that Gilchrist told filled in a lot of details that I hadn't had. There were 9 teenage boys. They ranged from sort of 17 years old to 21, 22. And 9 boys sounded almost like kids in a dinghy. I don't know if do you use the word dinghy? You know what I mean? Yes. So it sounded pretty small and amateurish until you realise they were off the coast of Africa, which was where they were arrested, which was a long way from Hydra. So it sort of didn't gel. It was something a bit weird about it, I thought. The ship they attacked was sailing from Malta to Alexandria to supply the Egyptians. And if you're familiar with Greek history of the revolution, the Egyptians were the allies of the Ottoman Turks, and they were assembling their fleet to attack Hydra at the time because we're 6 years into the war, and the Hydriots had been inflicting great losses on the Turks. Not the Egyptians yet. The Egyptians were just coming into the fray, but they had a wonderful navy trained by the French. And so there was a real worry that they were going to destroy Hydra, which was the centre of the Greek navy at that time. So they were arrested by a British anti-pirate ship. And at the boys' trial in Malta 6 months later, their defence said that this was a neutral ship going to a port belonging to an enemy of Greece, and therefore by international law, these boys were allowed to remove articles of war from this ship. In other words, they were not pirates. But the prosecution said, hang on, if they were only after articles of war, why did they take all the food from the ship, the crew's clothes, and even the captain's watch? None of those are articles of war. But the worst evidence of all for the boys were that they left the sulphur on board, and the only real war material was the sulphur, which was used to make gunpowder. And so the trial took 5 days, and they had a lot of trouble coming to a verdict. But in the end, they did, and they agreed that the boys, because of this sulphur, they found them guilty of piracy, and they were sentenced to death. And I have to say at this time, actually no, I'll come to that later. So I'm still reading Gilchrist's book, and there was another surprise hidden in the notes at the back of Gilchrist's book. It said on Ghikas' death certificate, his father was listed as Nikolaos, gentleman of Hydra. And on Hydra, Gilchrist explained, at that time, the word meant ship owner. There were only 3 classes of people on the island: the ship owners, the ship's captains, and the sailors, because there was no other way to make a living. So I said, hey, John, your ancestor might have been the son of one of the wealthiest ship owners in the Aegean. That's good, John said. I'll just put out the bins. I should say John was actually delighted to be descended from a Greek pirate. He just didn't need all the documentary evidence I was offering him to feel good about it. He was satisfied with one answer, one ancestor, one good story, done. And it was around that time that he began to flinch every time he heard the word Ghikas. I'd corner him at breakfast and launch into 1828 piracy trials in Malta before he'd even poured milk on his Weet-Bix. Did you know the British held Malta, I'd say? He did not. He didn't want to, not at breakfast anyway. And it became clear that the only person in the household who was emotionally invested in 1828 piracy trials was not the man who had to live with me. So for Christmas in 2017, John gave me a ticket to Hydra under the Christmas tree. And if you've been married for 50 plus years, you will recognise this move as strategic. It's the gift that says, I love you, please go and be obsessed somewhere else. And so off I went to Hydra. It was nothing like I expected, really. Tiny, rocky, basically no soil, no fresh water. And in Ghikas time, if you wanted to eat, you had one option, and that was the sea. So the Idriots settled there in the 1400s, 1500s, refugees from Albania originally, from Turkish persecution. And when they came, there was no alternative. They built ships, they traded, they carried goods further and further, and occasionally they liberated other people's cargo, a classic Greek business model. And they became magnificent sailors. And during the Napoleonic Wars, they shipped Russian wheat to Europe in defiance of the British blockade and became famous for giving the British Navy the slip, and Napoleon paid them handsomely for it. If you've been to Hydra, in the cathedral, there's a beautiful sterling silver chandelier that Napoleon is reputed to have given them. Some people say they stole it, who knows? So to be on Hydra, I was really trying to find out who his family was. Was he really the son of a ship owner? I wasn't having a lot of luck in finding out that sort of thing, but I was certainly able to absorb what Hydra was like at the time that Ghikas was there, which was an essential part of my research. And the island's architecture told me a lot about the sort of people they were. The great ship owners' houses were stacked on the hills up around the harbour, 3 and 4 stories of plain stone, quite austere buildings. They kept the gold leaf, the carved ceilings, the European furniture, the fountains, and even gardens of imported soil from the mainland inside their compounds, where their friends could admire it, but passing pirates could not. So I rang John from Hydra and he said, John, your ancestor probably grew up in a mansion and a hontico. And he said, that's nice, darling. Did you remember to pay the rates? So the owners of these houses poured everything they had into the Greek Revolution, ships, money, and even their sons, because obviously there was no funding for this revolution. It was really depending on, for the naval battles, on the ship owners of Spetses, Zara and Hydra. But by 1827, the revolution was hanging by a thread. The mainland was devastated. People were starving, and Greece desperately needed the great powers, especially Britain, to step in. And Britain's message was blunt. We might, but if you stop attacking our ships, here we have Ghikas, has come straight in to this political situation where they really needed the help of the great powers, but these kids have just robbed a neutral ship. When I first went to Hydra, I went in winter, which you will know from, if you've seen this book, the book that I read, wrote Hydra in Winter, about this trip to Hydra. I knew that I went in winter because the ticket was burning a hole in my pocket. I couldn't bear to wait. And I went to the archives and, spoke to them, but there was no knowledge on the island of these boys, of these 9 boys. When I went to the archives, a lovely woman called Elaine gave me a printout, and it was the printout from the Monaro Pioneers website in Australia. So there was no knowledge of them, which I thought was strange. If they were freedom fighters against the Turks, I would have expected people to at least, be some awareness of them. But anyway, I also met members of the Voulgaris family, especially Maria, who is a historian, and she takes historical walks around the port. And she called me auntie, which is probably the most Greek thing that has ever happened to me. But was Ghikas actually part of that family? I had my doubts. The Voulgaris family was a family of 6 brothers, and Maria's great-great-great-grandfather had become a prime minister after the revolution was over. So was Ghikas part of this family? I didn't know, and I couldn't find that out on the island. And this is an island that remembers everything. Heroes have statues, streets are named after heroes, and yet Ghikas and his friends were nowhere. No plaque, no family stories, just silence. And in a culture built on philotimo, that deep sense of honour, duty, and pride in your name, their absence spoke volumes. As the ferry pulled out of Hydra, when I was leaving, my phone buzzed and it was a text from Maria. And she said, you should go to see the Genealogical Society in Athens and ask for Mr. Mavrideros. And that turned out to be a breakthrough. Mr. Mavrideros was writing a book about the Voulgaris family, so he knew them better than anyone. He didn't know me from a bar of soap, and yet he and I exchanged letters for years, and he did it solely out of kindness. He was the most wonderful, wonderful gentleman. His letters were very formal and with beautiful manners, and a lot like all the dealings I had with Greek people in my research, actually. And at the beginning, he couldn't find Ghikas either. But finally, between us, using the names that Ghikas gave his children in Australia, he pieced it together. And finally, he was satisfied. He thought that Ghikas was the son of Nikolaos, who was one of the 6 brothers in Maria's famous family. His exact words in his letter to me were, there are no mysteries anymore left. I wondered about that though. So I'd been to Hydra and I'd seen the island. I'd seen these magnificent houses. I'd learned a lot about the history. I'd read as much about the revolution, etc., as I could. And I read lots of primary sources of the time, and I found Google Books wonderful for that. I was lucky that at this period in Europe, it was the period of the grand adventure, when wealthy young people would do the grand tour of Europe and often kept diaries. And I was able to read a couple of them who'd visited Hydra in the 1820s and had described the people, described the houses, described the women of the grand houses. And that was a wonderful introduction. But I still didn't feel that I had found out, even though I knew who his parents were from Mr. Mavrideros, there were still a lot of questions that I, wanted answers to. And so I said to John, how about we go to Malta? I mean, I'd read Mr. Gilchrist's book, but I just felt if I read the trial records myself, the actual trial records, and went to Malta, because by this time I'm starting to think I'm going to write a book about this Ghikas Voulgaris. And I thought even if I don't find anything extra in Malta, I want to go and see the island so I can describe it. So John came this time. He was weakening. I dragged him into the National Library where he had to wear a researcher lanyard. And by then I was dumping Maltese history on him like a malfunctioning cement truck. And we were handling books the size of a truck, ones that you had to get a big pillow, even to open them on the desk. So I'll just give you a bit of background to Malta and the Mediterranean at this time during the War of Independence. The British admiral was called Admiral Codrington, and he was getting thoroughly fed up with Greek pirates. His anti-pirate ships had arrested hundreds of Greek pirates that year with not a single conviction. And British merchants all around the Mediterranean were furious. The insurance companies were furious, and Codrington was clearly determined to make an example of somebody. And of course, we know that Greece was absolutely on its knees by this time. People were starving, they had no shoes, they had no clothes. Ibrahim Pasha was laying waste to the Peloponnese. And so, of course, what the British called piracy was rife at that time because people had nothing. And, and the ship owners too, trying to fund this war, they had borrowed money from the English at extortionate interest rates, which was scandalous, really. But they were using their own ships. So, of course, they were turning to piracy to try to recover some of the money and to feed people. Anyway, so Admiral Codrington was determined to make an example of someone, and unfortunately for these boys, they were going to be it. Before I left Australia, and I mean, we're so lucky these days with the internet, aren't we? Because you can search anything. And, if you're lucky and you just follow one lead to another, to another, to another, you can fall down rabbit holes, but you can also find out a lot. And I'd been very lucky. I had researched what the jails were on Malta, and I found there were 3 jails. One of them was enormous and held 500 men, and in big dormitories too. It sounded like an absolute hellhole. And there was another one called the Castellania jail where people seemed to be held before their trial. And I found something called the Blue Book online, and it was the account of who was in the jails at this time. I mean, there's one thing about the British, they have great records of that sort of thing. And I found this Blue Book for 1828 when the boys were in jail, and I found on one line 43 pirates. That didn't mean anything to me, but I thought perhaps this Castellania jail was where they would have been held. And so before I went, I wrote to the Department of Health, it was by this stage, and asked if I could see. I'd heard that, the cells were still there and not filled in. And so when we went to Malta, I went to the Department of Health, and I was very lucky they had an historian who took me upstairs to where the boys were tried. And that room is exactly the same as it was 200 years ago, which was just fantastic. And then he took me downstairs to the cells, and that was really an eye-opener because they are totally underground. Most of them had no window at all. But the one he took me into, he opened a massive vaulted door with a peephole for the guards to look in. And the cell was tiny, about 4 meters by 3, with dank walls and a high arched ceiling and a single tiny barred window high up at footpath level, and it was letting in a sliver of light. And so I thought, oh my goodness, imagine at least that cell had a little bit of light, but men in the other cells would have had no light whatsoever. And they were held in that jail for 18 months. And I think what affected me most was when I looked at the floor of that cell, scratched into the stone was a board game. It looked a little bit like a miniature hopscotch game that they played with stone chips. And I could feel a cold damp rising up through my feet. And I just thought, my God, 18 months in this cell. I couldn't shake the thought of eating and sleeping on that floor for 18 months, never feeling the sun and not knowing if you'd live or die. So that cell stayed with me, and I also did a lot of research at the archives at Rabat. The National Library is, in the main part of Malta in Valletta, and I also went to Rabat to the archives, read everything I could read, and did find out other things that I didn't know, but nothing big. So I still didn't know a lot about how the English had caught them or where was their ship. So I said to John, I've got to go to London. I've got to go to the Kew archives now. This time there's a limit to the number of continents a husband is going to cross in 1 year. And so he said, no, you do that yourself. Off you go. He's happy for me to do this research. And so later that year off, I went to London, and I was spent 2 weeks at Kew Archives, And that was solid gold. I sat in seat 44B, and before I went, I was able to research online what documents they had, and then I could order them so that when I got there, there's a system of lockers. You say what you want the next day, you put in your order. When you get there the next day, your books are in your locker. You take them out, put them on your trolley, and you take them to your chair. So I did that for 2 weeks. So I'd ordered the captain's log of the Gannet, the anti-pirate ship that arrested them. And that was magnificent. I found the actual entries for when he arrested them. And it was absolutely amazing because this is late July 1827, and on one day he said, "We have sighted a strange sail on the horizon." And he gave chase every day. He gave chase. They gave him the slip for a couple of days, but of course he had a big ship with 120 crew, and as far as I know, this is ship with 9 boys on it, and probably with shallow draft, a quick ship. Anyway, they played cat and mouse between Crete and Africa before he finally caught them on the 31st of July. And so I'm reading this day by day, what rations they had. He'd given his crew what he'd broken open a cask of spirits, etc., etc. So that was wonderful. And then when he arrested them, he said he had arrested, and this is the day that I know they were arrested. He had written that he arrested 43 Greek pirates. And I thought, how is this? What, have I got the wrong ship? Is this? And I thought, no, it can't be wrong. And so then I ordered the ship's muster, which is the names. And in the ship's muster, there were the 43 Greek names, including Ghikas and the other boys on the ship. But in fact, you see, it was a big ship. It wasn't a little 9-crew boat at all. It was a proper ship. And so that put a completely different complexion on it for me. It was one of the high points of my life, really, discovering that, because everything else I had ever read said there were 9 boys. And in the captain's log, he also said he had arrested a Turkish pirate ship earlier in the week. So he had 50 Turkish pirates on the deck. They were sleeping on the deck the ship's carpenter had made a sort of a pen for the Turkish prisoners, and then he made another one for the Greek prisoners. And so they were sleeping out on the deck. And he had sent some of his crew back to Malta to sail the Turkish ship home earlier in the week, but he didn't have enough crew left now to sail the Greek ship back. And so he towed it back. And just in case you read the book, I won't tell you, but it didn't end happily, the towing operation. But it also told me that when I'd been on Hydra, Elaine in the archives had told me about a ship called the Heracles, and they have the most fabulously immaculate records of the shipping in the Revolution, the maintenance, the wages, the cannon, everything. And she had found a ship called the Heracles, but we had both thought it was too big for the 9 boys. But now, of course, that I knew there were 43, it put a whole different complexion on it. And so it seemed certain that it was this ship. And the interesting thing about that ship was that it belonged to Ghikas's cousin, Maria's great-great-great-grandfather, who became the Prime Minister. And suddenly, the fact that Ghikas wasn't appearing in his family records started to make sense. I thought, well, maybe the shame of losing his cousin's ship might have been enough for them to be forgotten as having done something shameful in losing such a wonderful ship. Anyway, so then one afternoon back at home on this ship business, when I was reading the Niles Register 1829, as one does when one's a research obsessive, I discovered what had happened to the Heracles. The British sold her as a piracy prize, and the proceeds were distributed between the English admiral, the captain of the anti-pirate ship, and every man in the crew. That they got £2,000 for that ship. So it certainly was, a big ship and well worth sort of capturing. So just to be clear, the British tried 43 Greeks for piracy, sentenced 7 of them to death, took the ship, sold it, and kept the money, which rather does broaden one's understanding of the word piracy. But the takeaway was this: Ghikas lost his cousin's ship. So I wondered, did this explain why they had been forgotten on Hydra? And that was where the story turned. 1836, 8 years after the arrest, and the 7 Greeks have settled in Australia. Ghikas is 7 years into his 14-year sentence and is living with his wife Mary at Braidwood. And the brand new Greek state, barely 5 years old, went to extraordinary lengths to secure pardons for these men. And there were 7 of them, as I said, in Australia. And 5 of them took the pardons and went home to Greece. But Ghikas did not, and neither did his best friend. He said no. And that raised another question for me. Why would a man turn down a hero's welcome at home and choose to stay in a convict colony at the end of the earth? I didn't mention either that in my research, I thought they were tried in Malta, held in jail in Malta for 18 months, and then they weren't shipped to Australia until 1829. So they had to be held in England somewhere, waiting for the ship to take them to Australia. And as you probably know, the British their jails were overflowing, and so they were using old ships, decommissioned ships with the masts removed as jails. And they had Hulk records. And I was able to find that online, that the boys were held in a Hulk before they were shipped. So that added even more fuel to the fire for this story, because that would have been a horrific experience after 18 months in jail on Malta and then months in a Hulk in Portsmouth. It would have been absolutely terrible. So I'm still thinking that I'm going to write a book about Ghikas, and it's getting stronger and stronger feeling all the time. And the girl he married was a girl from Cork, an Irish orphan. There were ships of Irish orphans taken to New South Wales, and she was on one of those ships. And I thought I had to find her story too in order to write this historical fiction. And so after I went to Kew, then I went to Cork City. And that was a bit difficult because she was an orphan and they were brought up in what they call foundling hospitals or orphanages. The British had burned Cork City in 1920, so all the orphanage records had been destroyed at that time. But I did find the front door of the original orphanage, and it's part of a brewery now, but I was able to see where mothers left their babies in the middle of the night because they couldn't feed them. The poverty in Ireland, this is pre-famine, but it's becoming really bad. And so I found the front door of that orphanage, and that was quite moving, really, to think of the poor girls who did have to leave their babies and abandon them, knowing that the orphanage would feed them. Before I left Australia, though, I had written to a genealogist in Ireland and asked for birth records that would suit the records, for Mary in Australia. And I had 5 or 6. There were about 8 or 9. Some of them I could dismiss, but there were 5 or 6 that seemed likely, but I had no way of telling which it would be. And so I thought I just hired a car and off I set in Cork to go to each town, because her death certificate said that her father was a farm labourer. I wasn't sure how she would have known that. And his name was John Lyons. So I hired a car and started driving. I went through town after town, nothing. I stopped at churches. I just didn't get a feeling that I was getting anywhere, and there was no guarantee I was going to get anywhere anyway. But then I drove into a town called Inniskeen, and I went into the church, and a woman stopped saying her rosary, and she came over to me and she said, can I be, I can't do a very good Irish accent, but she said, and can I be helping you now? She told me about Father Tom, the priest of the church, and that there was a huge baptism record. He kept it in a safe. And she introduced me to Father Tom, and he showed me Mary's record in this huge, so thick, the book. And it just felt right. Everything felt right. Everything was sort of dropping in place here. And then Teresa told me about a fellow called John Joe Lyons and his wife Ursula. And she said, they're the authorities on the Lyons family in Enniskeen. They know everything about every Lyons that's ever lived. And they've got a farm outside Enniskeen, and they've farmed the same 50 acres for centuries. And so I rang John Joe and I went out to see him, and he was absolutely amazing. He knew everything about the family. He talked about people in the Lyons family as if he'd seen them last Tuesday at the post office. And he knew exactly who he thought Mary's parents could have been. Anyway, we talked for ages and ages. And when I said just late in the afternoon that I'd have to get going because I didn't want to drive back to Cork City in the dark, Ursula said, so you're not wanting to see the house then? And I got goosebumps. We were sitting in a perfectly nice 2-story brick veneer modern house. And she said, the original house is out the back. John Joe and I lived there until 4 or 5 years ago. And so they took me out the back to this original cottage, and it had a kitchen and dining room together, a sitting room, and then upstairs there were 2 bedrooms. On one side, Mum and Dad's bedroom, and then on the other side, 7 boys lived in the other bedroom. At this time, there was a family of 7 boys at this time. And suddenly, Mary didn't seem to be a name on a page anymore. I just felt that her father had been born in that very house. I'll never know for sure, of course, but it just seemed amazing that it would all fall into my lap like that. And so I sat in the car after I left the house before I went back to Cork, and I rang John, and he doesn't ever care when I'm travelling. He doesn't care if I ring him in the middle of the night. And he said, that's wonderful, darling. How many cows per acre do they carry? That was his main concern. So at that stage of my research, the British weren't having their finest hour, really. They'd sentenced the boys to death. They'd transported them to a penal colony. They'd sold the ship and kept the money, and they'd burned Cork City. But at least they did help destroy the Turkish fleet at Navarino. So that was one thing in their favour. But Ghikas, so I felt that I had enough of his story then to, to be able to write a book. I kept researching, of course. I researched all the time I was writing it. And even after I published Son of Hydra, and this is Son of Hydra here, even after I published it, there's a retired admiral of the Greek Navy wrote to me, Herakles Kalogerakis. I'm probably mangling that. But even he was able to give me information that I didn't have, because of those 43 pirates, only 9 had been able to be what do you call it, identified by the crew of the Maltese ship they robbed. And so all those boys had been sent home to Hydra. And I'd always wondered how they got home. I assumed they'd worked their passage home because obviously it's not terribly far. But yes, the Rear Admiral was able to tell me that when Kapodistrias was being taken to Greece on a British ship, on their main ship, when he was being taken to Greece to take up his new position as governor, they also picked up the Maltese boys, the boys, and took them home again. So that was something I never would have found out by myself. That was things like that kept happening the whole time, actually, through my research. So I spent 8 years writing the book. When I got to 2018, I did those trips. By the time I got to 2024, I thought I was pretty well happy with the book I'd written, except I couldn't find a publisher, and I decided to self-publish it. But I thought, no, before I self-publish it, I will do a little book just to try it out, just to make sure I can do it. I don't want to risk the big book at this stage. So that was when I did that one. I used the diary that I'd written when I went to Hydra, and I published that first, just thinking it was a little test run. And in fact, it went to #1 and it on Amazon, and it still goes to #1 sometime, which is great. I was very pleased about that. And it gave me the confidence then to self-publish Ghikas himself. And so, since then, they've both sold really well, and I've had a wonderful time. Descendants of Ghikas have contacted me in Australia, and I've spoken to lots of book clubs and writers groups like yours. And next Sunday, I'm speaking at the Hellenic Club in Canberra, which is our capital city, which is down near where Ghikas eventually settled, near the Snowy Mountains. So I'm looking forward to that very much. But yes, you can see my research was a real obsession, but you've all, I'm sure, had to research parts of your book, so you can probably understand just how caught up you could get in it, and you just want to keep going until you find out everything you possibly can. So thank you for listening. You've been very patient and good. That's been a very long talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shelley. Before we go to Q&A, do you have any quick tips for any of our writers as they embark on research, or maybe they hit dead ends, or what have you?
Maria, I did go to a couple of classes early on about how to research and what to research. But in fact, I think everything I did, I learned myself from the internet. Google is the most amazing thing, isn't it? I think the main thing I learned was, and it applied to Ghikas' name, as you said, as much as anything, you just have to keep trying different spellings if you're using Greek names, because for me, there were British people writing all these names down. So, of course, there were lots of different spelling. And when I was looking for the ship, trying to find out what happened to their ship, in some places it was spelled H-E-R, in others it was spelled E-R, it was spelled E-R-A-K, E-R-A-C. And I only found it in the end because I just happened upon it. And it was a spelling I hadn't thought of. Coming up with your search terms and keeping at it, I think, was the main thing that paid off for me. Not being happy just to use one search term, to try as many as you can. And eventually, if you're obsessed enough, things do turn up for you. The things that we, and I can't speak Greek either, and you probably can. You probably, are able to read Greek, which I couldn't. And that was a big disadvantage to me. I could use Google Translate, which is not bad. I used it. Mr. Mavrideros sent me a book written by Matten about the revolution, and I read that whole book with Google Translate, but it was pretty difficult. So, if you can read in Greek and you're researching Greek things, that would be an enormous help. I found the Benaki Museum absolutely magnificent. They have recreated an entire room from the Voulgaris mansion, and so that and a lot of the costumes they have there. And of course, there were wonderful archives on Hydra with models of ships and with costumes. Yes, I think it's just when you're researching, just keeping at it is the thing, isn't it? And if you become obsessed, as I did, it's no hardship. I mean, it gives you great joy when you find something. It's like being a detective, isn't it?
Okay. Well, let's open up for some Q&A. Does anybody have any questions for Shelley?
You're probably all stunned after listening all that time.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Patty.
I really enjoyed your talk. It was fascinating, a lot of information, a lot of historical context, especially during that time of for the Greek independence and tying that in with pirates and even Capodistrias. I mean, there's just a lot of stuff going on there. How long did it take for you to research this? And when did you know when you were finished?
Yes, I guess it took me 10 years, Patty, altogether. And really, I'm still finding things out, I'm still reading whenever I have the opportunity. I even read novels of the time, actually. I read a romance about a romance during the revolution. So yes, it took me 10 years to do it, I guess. Yeah. And all the time I was, a lot of those years I was writing at the same time. I'd come to a part of the book where, I'd say, well, they took the Heracles and they were going down to the coast of Africa. I don't know if they intended to do that to begin with. So then I would think, so how much water did they need to take? So that would take me down a rabbit hole into how much water does a man need a day? And if they were going to be away for 2 weeks, how much would they take? And how would they carry it? There's no end, is there, to the fine detail when you're actually writing. I mean, you've got that bank of knowledge to begin with, but you're also researching as you go, aren't you? As you're writing, what did they wear? What would he have had on his feet? What would they have been eating? All of that sort of thing. But yes, I'd say 10 years, Patty.
Thank you, Patty. Anybody else have any questions? Eleni?
Yeah. Shelley, thank you for that fascinating talk. We really enjoyed it. As I listened to you, I could tell that obsession that was just driving you, and I could see you had great fun. So it wasn't a burden, although I'm sure there were days when you got to bed at night and you were like, okay, I'm finished now. But so I wanted to ask you, in this whole process, you have the research, then you have the writing, then you have the publication. Out of those three, which was the most challenging for you? Did the writing just, because those were your first books. So had you taken any writing courses or workshops? How did you blend? I mean, how did you deal with all those challenges while you were doing this?
Oh, Eleni, I'm hearing you, because when I started, for a start, which was the most challenging? The research I loved, the writing I loved, although it was very challenging, but the marketing I'm finding the most challenging, only because you want to be writing, you don't want to be marketing, you don't want to be selling your book. You really just do want to leave that and get on to the next project. So, but of course, if you write a book, you've got, obviously you want to get it in front of the public. And so marketing I've found the most challenging, really. But the writing, coming back to the writing, Eleni, when I started, I mean, I've written all my life, but I've never written anything like a book. And I was silly enough to think that I could just sit down and write a novel. And I wrote about 10,000 words to begin with. And then there was an historical novel conference on in Australia. It happens every year And I thought you could submit 10,000 words and get it reviewed. And so I thought I'd do that. And I went down to the conference at Parramatta, which is just west of Sydney. And when I got there and was sat down with the reviewer, I had made every mistake in the book. I had head hopped, I had info dumped, by the time I finished listening to her, I was absolutely flattened. I thought, oh my God. I didn't realize, I mean, how silly is this? I didn't realize there was any such thing as structure. I didn't know what point of view was. I really knew absolutely nothing. So you're right, Elaine, at that stage, I thought, I've got to go right back to square one. I've got to start doing courses. I've got to start reading books on how to write. And those bookshelves up behind me, there are shelves and shelves of books on how to write. And, bit by bit, I learned. I mean, I'm still learning how to write. You never ever stop learning, do you? But
Yep.
certainly learning structure and plot and, learning just everything about writing. I mean, I've loved that too. That's become an obsession as well, just the learning to write. And being part of a writers group, as you are, is one of the most valuable things that happened, because we do review each other's work and critique each other's work. And we all knew as little as each other, I think, when we started. We did a 6-month Write Your Novel course with the Australian Writers Centre. As I said, it was during COVID. And so it was wonderful in more ways than just learning about how to structure a novel and how to write it. But it also gave me that writers group, which was wonderful. And we're still together and we still meet once a month. But we have a Discord chat room. I don't know if you know what Discord is, but it's a software that it's a chat room and it's open all day. And there's generally someone in the chat room. And we don't talk about anything except writing. And so there's all different channels in there. There's channels about pitching or channels about, Scrivener, anything. And we chat all day about stuff like that. When you're writing, I will even go into the chat room and say, would you put a comma here? Or would you, we just talk about writing. We become good friends and we know things about each other's families. But yes, I've absolutely loved learning to write. And learning to write fiction, though, is completely different, of course, from writing non-fiction too. And so I did both of those things. And even when I wrote the little one, even when I wrote that, I didn't know anything about structuring non-fiction either. And it was a surprise to me to realise that if you write a memoir like that, it's also got to have a character arc. I found out that Ghikas had to have a character arc, but I also found out that if you're writing non-fiction, I had to have a character arc too in that book. I had to start off as one person, go through a character arc, have a climax and a denouement at the end. And so, yes, it's been a very steep learning curve really for me. I mean, a lot of people, I guess, have always wanted to be a writer and have been learning how to do it all their lives. But I've just loved it. I mean, there's nothing I like more. And this is probably why I said I'd do this at 2:00 in my morning, because I often wake up at 2:00 in the morning and suddenly think, I know what I should have put in chapter 7. And I race downstairs, to my desk here, and I'll write. Sometimes I'll write till dawn, because writing is just such a passion. I just love it so much. And I love so much that I've discovered it at this age. And it's something you can do till you die, really, as long as you can see a screen or hold a pen. You can do it forever, which a lot of your interests you can't do. And so does that answer your question? I'm very good at talking, Elaine. I'm sorry, that's a very long answer.
No, I love to hear your answer, because I thought I was the only person who has said, okay, I'm going to sit down and write a novel. Then when I sat down to do it, I'm like, I have no idea what I'm doing here. This is terrible. What's in my head isn't resonating on the page. And I had to do basically what you did. I didn't have all the research that you had to do. I had some, but not like you. So yeah, it's good to hear somebody else saying this is what I went through, and you're like, yeah, that happened to me too. So yeah.
Exactly. And you know, Elaine, even with this book I'm writing now, this book, which is sort of about my reinvention, you know, from cattle farmer to writer at this age of my life, even writing that, I suddenly thought the other day, I don't even really know anything about writing a memoir. You know, so upstairs next to my bed now, I've got about 10 books about how to write memoir. You know, even though I wrote that little book, there's a lot I still, you know, I didn't know that you had to do scene and transition. I didn't do that in that little book, or if I did it, you know, it just happened. Yeah, so now I've done the same thing. I've almost finished that book, and yet now I'm having to go back and read how to do it, you know, and now I'll probably have to rewrite it. So I don't learn.
Can I say one more thing? I get so fascinated when I listen to fellow writers, and I also have a ton of how-to books, which I've read, but I found that the best way is to actually sit and do it. Then I can understand, oh, that's what so and so meant. You know, so there's nothing like actually doing it yourself. And I remember many, many years ago when I first arrived in Atlanta, there's a famous Greek author, Nicholas Gage. You will know him. And he came to Atlanta, and I went up to him afterwards and I said, can you give any advice to a beginning author? And he said, yes, I've got 6 things to tell you. So I thought I should have brought a notepad with me. And then he said, you have to read, and you have to write. And that was like, and I looked at him and I'm like, okay, whatever. He's just been a typical writer. He's dismissive. He's like putting up his protective barrier, whatever. You know, 30 years later, I think about him and I think that's probably some of the best advice I ever got.
Absolutely. So true, isn't it? They say if you haven't got time to read, you haven't got time to write.
Exactly.
Yes, it's so true. Yes.
Exactly. Well, thank you, Shelley, so much. It's just a fascinating talk, just going on this journey with you. We're so grateful for you getting up in the middle of the night and joining us today. And we wish you much success with the books and the upcoming books. And
I wish you all success.
Thank you.
Great success with your writing. It's lovely to meet you all.